So hi, everyone. My name is Mike Bastido. I'm from the University of Michigan. I'm here to talk about a study I did here with Dominique Baker at the University of Delaware, looking at simulating the based admissions in the US. I picked this topic because it has really global significance. You can look at lots of different country contexts and see proposals for lotteries. They have been done in different country contexts, including in the Netherlands and in France and some other places. And so what we wanted to do was to try to better understand what are the diversity implications of switching to a lottery? Because when a lot of policymakers and academics make proposals for lottery-based admissions, they often make some pretty big claims about the kinds of problems that would be solved, and it's treated as a bit of a panacea. Um, so I'll try to get started here. Oops. Yep. Hopefully it switched over. Okay. So what are the problems that people are trying to solve? So in holistic or contextualized admissions in the UK, there are very specific issues that are raised that are completely legitimate. So I generally put these in four buckets, one of which is about transparency. So in a holistic process, and I'll just keep saying holistic, but here contextualized also. In holistic process, you really don't know how admissions decisions are being made behind the scenes. It creates a kind of black box. So if you have a different kind of system, I mean, if you have a Gaokao type system, for example, in China, you know exactly like what the exams are going to look like. You take exams, you get scores, you can see what scores get you into what kinds of institutions, you set up priority lists, et cetera. Like it's a much more transparent system for people to understand how it works. Holistic systems are not like that. There are equity concerns that create holistic admission systems, and there are equity concerns that come out of holistic admissions admissions processes. So if you are doing a more holistic process, there are big concerns about who has the resources to put into extracurricular activities, the tests and examinations, essay preparation or Oxford interview preparation. What kinds of shadow education are being created in order to meet the needs of students and applicants who are going into holistic admissions. We don't really know exactly what fairness means in a holistic process. It's an open question. And we don't know if admissions officers themselves are going to be fair to everyone. How do we have some accountability for that? And then finally, we have corruption scandals not just in the US, where it was called Varsity Blues, but in countries around the world. In Korea, the justice minister was sacked for getting his daughter into one of the Sky institutions by fabricating, if I recall, research articles in biology or medicine. But there have been scandals in China and Korea and a number of other places around holistic admissions. So there's big questions about how to prevent corruption, and something like a lottery could be a way to do that. So this screen just shows just a small sample of the number of newspaper articles in the US system, in the US that have pitched the idea of lotteries. It's pretty much on an annual basis. There will be some article in some major news outlet where someone pitches the idea of a lottery. They're also pitched by public policy think tanks, places like the New America or other places. It's not a small idea that someone has written in a corner. It's something that just comes up again and again and again and again. And in our paper, we have a lot of examples of it. They also go back a long time. And in the US system, there are calls from 1964 to try to go to a lottery system. So they've been also happening for quite a long time. So, what are the claims that are being made by these folks who do this? One is that it will allow you to cut the rot out of admissions. It will allow schools to avoid accusations of racial discrimination. It will take the sting out of disappointment for students who aren't admitted to the schools of their choice. It would allow schools to eliminate the SAT or ACT exams as a requirement. It would end debates over affirmative action. Although the Supreme Court did a pretty good job of that a couple of years ago. It would reduce inequality, and that is a very common claim in these articles. And then finally, there was a whole spate of these around COVID. So right around 2021, there was just a whole slew of articles making claims that because of COVID disparities, this was the time to move towards lottery-based admissions. Here at Oxford, there has been, just last year, there was a book called Born to Rule that was looking at stratification of Oxbridge candidates and over the whole course of pretty much the 20th century. And at the end makes a claim that Oxford would far benefit with respect to equity if they would move towards lottery-based admissions. So this is the article in the Telegraph. Feel a little bad for the authors. They wrote 340 pages of lots of data, and the Telegraph went with one paragraph in about page 328, where they sort of throw this idea out there that why shouldn't Oxbridge think about going to lottery-based admissions? So there have been a few descriptive studies previously in the US context. Most of them suggested that there would be negative effects on low-income students and students of color if we went to a lottery-based system. But a lot of them, actually pretty much all these studies, didn't really have more robust simulation methods to look at this question or examination of multiple lottery designs. One thing about the articles that you look at who propose this, they propose all different kinds of models for how a lottery would work. So we wanted to be able to simulate as many of them as possible in order to look reasonably at the idea and what its effects would be. Even though, I'll just point out, even though it's commonly discussed as a policy solution, Americans actually really hate the idea of lotteries. 83% of them do not like this idea, which is kind of interesting. I mean, we can barely get 83% of people to agree the sky is blue. So it's pretty interesting that we have such a high number there. So in this study, we did a simulation of the relationship between an admissions lottery and applicants' race, class, and gender. So essentially, what would admitted student classes look like if we actually implemented a lottery at selective colleges in the US? So we include all students who are enrolling in college in the most recent decade, examining a range of institutional selectivities, meaning not just the most selective schools, but also moderately selective schools in the US. And we try to look at multiple cutoffs for lottery eligibility. So almost everyone who proposes a lottery in the US says there has to be some sort of academic bar over which students would need to clear. They all have different ideas of what that academic bar would look like. But I can think of only one person who has actually suggested that all eligible students could participate in a lottery. So we needed to look at what different kinds of bars would look like if we did that and if we had, random draws. So our data for this come from two nationally representative surveys of 9th and 10th graders in the US. So these were funded by the National Center for Educational Statistics, which if you are American, no longer exists because it has been dismantled. There is one person left. But we used to collect great data on the American system, and these are the two most recent, and they were really helpful for this study. We also use some measures of institutional selectivity and also try to measure the cost of attendance. So when we do the analysis, what we're doing is we're comparing our enrollees through the lottery compared to the current system, right? So we want to define the pool of students who can enroll based on the current system. We want to define a certain set of eligibility criteria for the lottery, and then just look at the descriptive characteristics that come from that. So when we're doing a random lottery, we're not going to just do one lottery, right? Because there could be any kind of outcome from one particular randomly selected lottery. So what we want to do is draw a random set of students 1,000 times, right? So you want to look, again and again and again, and then look at what the range of outcomes looks like when you do it across those 1,000 times, to give you a sense of what might realistically happen, not just sort of cross-sectionally with one pool of data. And so you can see in these two data sets, we have a little over 1,000 students in each one of them who would be lottery eligible. And that gives us hopefully a reasonable estimate of what it would look like on a national basis in the US. When we say highly selective in this school, we're saying what's called a Barron's Category 1, which for this context would be better if I actually said what that means. Barron Category 1 would just be the most selective institutions in the US. So somewhere from the range of Harvard to the more selective liberal arts colleges like Williams or Amherst. But even most of the most selective public institutions don't come in at Barron's 1. They usually come in at Barron's 2, including my own institution. So the next two levels, Barron's 2 and 3, are selective. They're selecting usually less than 50% of their applicants, but they're not as highly selective as the most elite institutions. We only included on-time students who were looking at four-year institutions. So when we're looking at the different bars, what we're looking at the SAT or ACT score. When you see a standardized exam, those are the two entrance exams that are commonly used. And so what we did was we set the bar at the 25th and 50th percentile. And those are, fairly low bars. So I would like to point out that I think our estimates here are actually pretty conservative. A lot of people who make proposals actually propose higher bars. You can imagine if you're talking about a bar for schools like Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Princeton, that people might propose like you would need to be in the 95th percentile, for example. But we're setting rather conservative bars in order to make our results not seem like they're being sort of cherry picked just to make lotteries look bad, essentially. For grade point average, we've used two different measures. We can just look at the raw GPA, and we could also use weighted GPA. We've also set those at 25th and 50th percentiles. Again, very low percentiles. I mean, for these institutions, currently for these institutions, these would not be admissible grading profiles for students. So we've set fairly low bars. And then we just have a sort of combo as well, where we set the threshold where you have to have a certain GPA and a certain entrance exam score. So these are the common ways in which people propose to have a lottery. And then we're going to look at some of the characteristics of interest, and I'll focus here on race and income as the potential outcomes in terms of college enrollment. The headline here is that if you are looking at GPA only or SAT only lotteries, they do not create pools of significantly larger numbers of low-income students. They also have a really big impact on men. So the proportions of men in incoming classes actually drop pretty dramatically because the grades for men in high school are substantially lower than grades for young women. So those end up having a pretty substantial impact on the lottery outcomes. And there's not a single person in the US system who's ever considered what the gender outcome would be for a lottery, that it would create even more disparate gendered impacts. And if we look at the SAT and GPA lotteries for portions of students of color, I'll focus here on Black and Latinx students, they are really cut very seriously in lottery situations. There's one for one of the simulations, the proportion of Black students in the enrolled pool actually could go below 1% in the incoming class. And in the US context, keep in mind, 13% of people approximately are Black in the US. So let me show you some of the data from this. So these are graphs that show you it's a little bit easier in person. So I apologize, I'll have to describe to you in words what these look like, but essentially you can see that we have the proportion of students who are currently enrolled, and then we have the proportion of students who would be enrolled in these confidence intervals that are projected here. So on the left, this is the impacts on men, and these are the GPAs that are based on SAT scores and GPAs. So on the left, you can see that there isn't a huge impact for men if you use the SAT. In the US, men have a bit of an advantage on the SAT. Particularly on the math score. So when you use the SAT, you end up with numbers that look approximately similar. If you look at the GPA thresholds, that's where the proportions drop really dramatically. And you can see that the proportion of men starts to fall into like the 35 to 40% range. at these institutions, depending on which lottery that you're looking at. If you use a combination, for men, you still see drops in most of the lotteries that we run here. For Black students, this is where the proportions drop pretty dramatically. For highly selective and moderately selective schools, as you can see on the horizontal lines above, you see pretty big drops, and they're well below the confidence interval. And then in GPA, you also see pretty much the same. At the very top end of the confidence interval, in some of them, you see something approaching the current proportion of Black students, but for the most part, you would expect to see a pretty substantial drop at these institutions, and it's the same if you do a combo lottery. For Latinx students, you see the impacts aren't as strong as they are for Black students, but they're pretty similar to the effects. There's a very substantial drop, but it's not as severe as it is for Black students. And it's the same if we have the combination lottery that I described earlier. And then a lot of people focus on income and what would happen to the lowest income students who would come in, because a lot of people assume that if you have a lottery, then they would be eligible for the lottery and they would be more likely to enroll in situations where we have highly stratified educational systems. And that does not turn out to be true. And I'll explain why this is afterwards, but this is the sort of descriptive result of the simulations. And as you can see, there's pretty significant drops, particularly in the ELS lottery. And we have the same here in the combo as well. So even after we presented some of this analysis, that does not keep people from wanting to have lotteries. This is an idea that has often been somewhat impervious to data. And so these were just some articles that came out after. There were actually articles on our paper too, but afterwards, people were still more than happy to write op-eds saying, boy, lotteries, what a great idea it would be to have these things. So I wanted to call our paper "The Terrible, Horrible, Awful, Bad Idea That Will Not Die." Dominique wanted to get tenure, so she did that. But I think it's just I think I would like to explain sort of in the rest of the talk a little bit about why it is that this idea is so attractive to a certain cast of mind. But overall, the summary here is that these lotteries would have pretty devastating impacts on student diversity, and I think that makes them essentially unworkable. There are more problems than just the impacts on diversity, and they're very rarely considered in the sort of opinion pieces that are written about this. One is that there's a very carefully built relationship between students and colleges. The admission system in the US is very much built to be the beginning of a relationship in which you are selected to be a part of an institution, and that helps to build an emotional relationship between you that lasts throughout your time as a student and once you're an alum, and hopefully someone who gives billions of dollars after you graduate. And so creating a system in which you're randomly selected to an institution really sort of intervenes in that built relationship. And I think we would see that here at Oxford, we would see in the US. It's also very unclear how people intend to handle the issue around majors and programs and units. So we don't simulate it for you here, but any lottery for small programs would create devastatingly large differences in the number of students who would be in any program. So if there's an anthropologist, if you're the anthropology program, you could end up with lotteries where you have 0 students who come out of the lottery who want to major in anthropology, and ones where you have 100 students who want to major in anthropology. Like, programs aren't built to take in a random number of students that are assigned to them, and it would create very big issues for the capacity of individual programs. You also have the problem of outlier cases. So this was not a lottery case, but here in the UK, there was the case of a student named Laura Spence, who was a very highly qualified state school student, and she had gotten 3 A stars, and she was denied admission to Oxford based on her interview. It appears, at least. And there was a national scandal. Gordon Brown like castigated Oxbridge for weeks about it, and there were tons of the stories in the newspapers here. And the poor woman had to go to Harvard, and so that sort of pointed out what can happen in certain kinds of outlier cases. That would happen in a lottery every single year you had one. So there would be a student who was extraordinarily qualified that the newspapers would absolutely love to pick out and go, can you imagine that, this Laura Spence equivalent has not been admitted when she won the Nobel Prize as a, high schooler. And so, I don't think that schools are at all prepared for that kind of case that would happen again and again. This happened in the Dutch system, and I think was part of the reason why the Dutch system actually the medical system has moved away from lottery, because of these cases of students who are pushed out by the lottery. And then finally, you just have an inability to consistently hit targets. So, much of what admissions officers and enrollment managers do is trying to hit very specific targets for both majors and units, about predicting yield, about needing athletes. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, on Saturday, I saw, I think, every Oxford student doing crew on the Cherwell. And so, what would happen for those sorts of things? It is a big issue as well. So I think advocates here only see the problems that they'll solve. So they see problems with affirmative action in the US or race-conscious admissions. They see issues with legacy preferences for alumni, the children of alumni. They see athletic preferences as a problem. They see preferences for donors as a problem. They see a lack of transparency. They see the corruption in varsity blues. Like, there's lots of things that you can point to that are admissions problems that suddenly a lottery solves. It's just a panacea that just cuts right through all of these problems, and to a certain cast of mind, that's a very appealing solution to lots and lots of problems. But I think what it was really notable is when you read what they write, they're very indifferent to the problems they create. They have no interest in engaging in any of the sort of other issues that would be created by a lottery and trying to work through them, because they themselves are never in the position where they would have to live with the consequences of the idea they're promoting. So here's a couple of quotes that I'll end with that come from political philosophers who've actually thought about lotteries on a broader level than just in higher education. They're both named Stone, but they're completely unrelated people. Deborah Stone says, lotteries give the appearance of being absolutely fair, and policymakers resort to them when they can't find principled reasons to justify their decisions. They have the political value of symbolizing absolute fairness because they don't allow bias or favoritism or pull. They dampen citizens' anger at being chosen for a burden or excluded from a benefit. But having participated in what seems like a fair game, losers are more likely to blame fate than politicians or university administrators for their predicament. And Peter Stone, who is an English philosopher, I believe, says, lotteries benefit from the sanitizing effects of ignorance. Meaning that, not having any idea of who's being selected creates sort of an absolution for everyone involved for needing to take responsibility for the systems that they create. So if you have more interest in this topic or would like to see more, feel free to Google the Michigan Admissions Collaboratory, which is the research group that I work with. And we have all this paper and all the other papers that we work in the holistic admissions space that are available free for download. And I'll take a second to hawk a book that is coming out, I believe, later this month. It is available for pre-order. And what this is a collection of some of the best work that's being done on holistic admissions in different country contexts. So there's actually not a single chapter here on the US. The chapters are about Korea and China and Singapore and Chile and a number of other countries around the world, and people who've done empirical research looking at those admission systems. So if you're interested in that, feel free to check that out. And so with that, go to Q&A.
Yes, perfect. Thanks, Michael. If you want to share your screen, then we can have it for you as well. I like the fact that your book had a picture of what looked like a rather elite college dining hall.
Oh, right. I know, right? Yeah, I did. I know, and I did kind of pick it.
That's fine.
It's actually the University of Michigan. It's my home campus, well, but it looks very English.
Okay, yes, I can imagine. Very confident. Well, that's great. Really interesting. So there are, a chance to put questions in the chat. I'm going to start this briefly. I mean, have anyone ever used lotteries in admissions? Has it been used?
The Dutch did it for medical admissions for I think at least about 20 years.
Okay.
And there are a few analyses of this out there, but not as many as I would hope for, considering how important it could be. There had been a couple of attempts in the U.S. very early on during the civil rights movement that did not work out. The French have used it for certain programs.
Okay.
So you have the problem with basically the comprehensive universities are open access, but certain programs get over enrolled. And so there's been kind of secrets lotteries going on. A lot of people don't seem to want to talk about them very much because of the whole philosophy of allowing open access to the universities. The whole system of Parker's Up and the admission system is actually quite controversial there as well. But they've had to engage in kind of quasi-lottery situations at times in order to decide who's going to get access to certain kinds of academic programs. But we have almost no analysis of that happening. If people have other examples out there, I'd be interested, but those are the main ones that
because what you were doing is you were comparing current admissions practices, which tend to be holistic in the US, with the simulation of a lottery.
Yeah.
If one was to compare the simulation lottery with, a Gaokao model,
right?
I wonder whether that would have been anyway. Rachel.
That was kind of my question, because it's quite interesting. So in the UK, we use contextualized admissions to mean something else, which is where you look primarily at the kind of academic achievement, and you give somebody a lower target if they were from an area of deprivation. So the contextualization is just about their home circumstances relative to their academic performance.
Right.
And I was just wondering if you've done any comparison between the lottery and that kind of system, because I think there's some evidence in the UK that actually has been quite effective.
Yeah.
And so that was my first question. The second was like, are there other lotteries in other parts of higher education? Because in the UK, one of our main funders has gone to a lottery-based system, which they argue, and I think the stats do actually support it, has been very effective in diversifying the pool of recipients of research grants, and other funders, I think, are thinking of following suit. So I was just wondering if that's happening at all in the US.
Yeah, I mean, there were people who have pitched this idea that, like, the National Science Foundation could set some sort of bar, like they could have ratings, for example, still have ratings by scientists or academics, and then there would be a certain number of that would go over whatever kind of bar, and then they would just choose randomly from that. And so I think it's an interesting idea. I'm not against lotteries for everything ever. But I would just want us to have a pretty clear analysis of what this would look like before we do it. And then on the first question, the UK and the US system aren't that different from one another. The holistic system in the US, the big difference between Oxbridge and Harvard, for lack of a better comparison, is the interview being so central. The interviews are not used in the US system almost at all, other than as sort of a recruitment tool. But in terms of like looking contextually at the opportunities that people have had in their families and high schools and neighborhoods is absolutely something that happens in the US system, with slightly different ways of looking at it. In the UK, you have like specific flags for like foster care, for example, for coming from a lower income postcode, stuff like that. Like this, there isn't like a flag in the US system that is quite exactly the way that the UK does it, but the general idea is pretty similar. So this would be comparing essentially holistic contextualized review to what a lottery would look like. In the US, when we call something holistic review, though, there is a really wide range of what we're talking about. So when I said to you earlier about what contextualized review is, it's a bit of an idealized system. We think right now, data that I have suggested about 30% of schools and admissions officers do this more contextualized review of what they mean by holistic. But that means 70% of them are actually doing something that is not quite contextualized. So the amount of variation across schools means that you can't look across schools and go, oh, this means all the practices are the same, because they're very much not. But it's the best we have, basically.
I was just thinking of like Raj Chetty's work, where they argue that if you took out like athletic sports considerations and legacy considerations, you actually get a very different profile of student.
I don't know if we get a variance. I mean, legacy is this much. I mean, they definitely want, and it's not just Raj. I mean, there's a lot of people in the US system who want to, move away from those, including me. Like, I think we should get rid of legacy, full stop. But the number of students who are impacted by legacy is not very much. Athletics actually impacts more students than legacy. And athletics is a sort of secret system in some ways, because because people look at athletes in college and they mostly watch college football and basketball, so they think that athletics is potentially an equitable way to have a preference because they see a lot of Black and brown people on the court and they think that these are the people who are getting benefits from athletics. But we have, dozens of athletes who come in through school through preferences, and most of them are not in football and basketball. And most of them are white and higher income. And so it's actually a pretty regressive preference when you look at it more carefully. So I don't see, the problem is I just don't see schools moving away from athletic preferences. I mean, it's just becoming more and more embedded. We're going into a system now where we have NIL, which is called name, image, likeness, which means that athletes are getting paid for the use of their name, image, license. So they're getting, we're getting, the lead quarterback for the Michigan football team got $10 million from a group of alumni through these NILs. We're talking about really, really large amounts of money that they are investing. The chances of schools disinvesting from the athletic complex is just zero. So as much as we might want to move away from these preferences, I just think it's just a bit pie in the sky for the US system.
Does that suggest then that all these headlines are, they're well-meaning, but they're not really going to have any political traction?
I think there's a chance of getting rid of legacy. Okay. And especially after, in the US, the affirmative action decision is called SFFA v. Harvard and the University of North Carolina. After the SFFA decision, a lot of people were pushing to say, hey, if we're not going to have race-conscious preferences, then can we at least get rid of some of these other preferences? And legacy is possible, I think, because there really is no good evidence to suggest that big donors walk away from donations. So that's what schools are all saying is that, it's going to ruin the relationship with the alumni and these children of the wealthy alumni in particular, they're not going to donate anymore, and that's going to harm the university. And it's really not that many students. And so it's really, a trade-off, basically. There's really not much evidence. They still want to get their kids into Stanford. So I think this is kind of a made-up problem. And so I think there's some hope in there. There could be more hope with different kinds of athletic preferences. If you were to just focus on the sports that are not remunerative and popular, you could potentially, but I think that's a tougher sell probably than the legacy preference.
It's also, from the UK perspective, the legacy thing is very, very strange.
It should be. And I would say in the US, I actually think it's illegal and unconstitutional, and it's just never been litigated. We actually have a law in the US called the Civil Rights Act of 1866 of all things. It actually says that you can't discriminate based on ancestry. I don't know how you can say a legacy preference is anything other than discriminating by ancestry. How some lawyer can figure out their way around this is beyond me. And it's just never been litigated. So I suspect at some point it finally will be litigated and found to be illegal.
That's an interesting case.
Yeah.
Well, we've got a question online or two. Glenn, you were first to post in the chat. Do you want to unmute and ask a question about psychology of lotteries?
Thank you so much, David. Thank you for that seminal study. It's really, really interesting. But, my question to you is that so many young people in United States and elsewhere in the world are at the crossroads, of making it to admissions, or even if they want to study at all. Okay, now, this is a factor all across the world, and it's becoming true due to several reasons. My question to you is, does your study factor in the vulnerability or the psychological kind of liabilities of your lottery system? And would there be any buffers that you would offer within that opportunistic lottery system to support the less privileged, I would say, to have a chance to go to college or university? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I think one thing you're suggesting is about the pressures that are on students and trying to get into these institutions, and a lot of which are related to the admissions process itself and what it demands of students. In the US, asking students to have so many different extracurricular activities in addition to all of their academic work and to demonstrate leadership and exceptional in those sorts of things is putting a lot of demands on students that are creating a lot of pressure. And obviously we see, essentially a mental health crisis in the US in our educational system right now. So a lottery could potentially help to address that issue. But there are also reasons why schools want to have those preferences as well. So I would say, my own personal solution for this is I think we should be looking very seriously at the things we ask of in admissions and try to make some reforms. And specifically around what we ask of students around extracurriculars and how we have essentially no limit on what we ask for. And two is around college preparation curriculum. So in the US system, we have advanced placement examinations, which are somewhat similar to the IB system. And there's absolutely no limit that we place on the number of AP courses and examinations that you can take. And it's not unusual now at top institutions to see students present somewhere between 9 and 15 of these AP exams that they had to take by the time they were juniors, by the way. So for them to be in the admissions system, it means you had to have taken that exam at the end of the junior year. And this is, basically a form of insanity. It doesn't create any additional information for admissions officer to make a good decision in order to pressure students to be taking this many high-level courses and examinations prior to entering college. So I think we can work within the existing system in order to address that issue. And I think in terms of participation in higher education and widening participation, the holistic system and contextualized admissions has the most ability to do that. It's really political pressures in a lot of ways that force institutions to restrict who is being admitted and why. But the philosophy of the system itself allows for a lot more equity. And I think if we implement it with fidelity, then we have a good opportunity there.
Good. Okay. Thank you, Glenn. That's a really interesting question. So Elizabeth, tell us about the Norwegian context and whether you think, why you think that could be useful to talk about a lottery in that context.
Well, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. So that in all of the Nordic systems, admission to higher education is primarily based on the grades that you get in upper secondary school. At least in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. Finland has a slightly different system, but still, it's based on that. So there are no or that's the main way of doing it, and it's very cost effective. And if you compare it to, I've been doing studies or as part of a EU study looking at admissions across Europe, and the interesting thing is that this is seen as very fair and transparent from a student point of view, because it's basically a rank based on your grade point average. And of course, this is then linked to, I've also done a study on medicine, and we also have the problem here that a lot of people who apply to medicine have very, very high grades. So it's really, really hard to distinguish. You need to have be at the very top in order to get admitted. Which means that you're basically not distinguishing between people. And I also launched the idea, what about doing a lottery for only then admission to medicine? And the university was like, no, we cannot do that because we have a grading system. The maximum is 6. And in a thought situation where a student who has 5.8 would not get a spot, but somebody who has 5.6 gets one. They're both excellent students. They're at the very top, but the one with 5.8 has a higher grade point average and should therefore. So that's the kind of logic. So the question is then, is actually lottery only relevant in a place where you have so much sort of grade inflation, or where you cannot use grades to distinguish between students? Because this is also a difference between the US and the Nordic countries in that sense.
Yeah. I mean, of course, the big issue in the US is just the highly stratified high school system, right? So, to a system that we just sort people on grades because it would just lead to such inequitable outcomes. We have no common curriculum. So
you also sort people on types of courses they can take, though. A lot of people do not attend a high school that makes you eligible to go to Harvard.
Yeah, it's pretty different. Yeah, there is. I mean, actually, right now I'm doing a project about calculus, and in the U.S., only half of high schools offer calculus at all. But a lot of schools actually basically expect that students take calculus and give a pretty big premium on students who have taken it, even if they're not going. I guess I'd also, I don't know if you've seen it, but there's actually a pretty good paper out of Denmark about holistic admission system being used there. And if you haven't seen it, if you send me an email, I'd be happy to send it to you.
Okay, yeah. No, I don't think I've seen that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. Eric, do you want to come in and ask about AI, which is sort of slightly tangential but interesting as well?
Yes, thank you so much. This is a great presentation. I'm a big fan of your work, as I said, and I'm curious whether you know of any studies. I know this is a little bit separate from the topic that you're looking at with lotteries, but thinking about other approaches, are there any studies that you know of about the use of AI in college admissions? Because there's a sort of argument that, you know, given a sort of proprietary LLM that looks at all of the admitted students over the past several years, they could predict those kind of ways in which, you know, at least make it much more efficient, if not more equitable, around who to admit from these vast pools of applicants that places like Harvard and other very selective institutions have. You know, the one of the critiques is that, you know, admissions officers, there's no way they're really reading everything. It's this sort of, you know, enormous Herculean effort that is put into place, and the incredible resources that go into admissions offices are also perhaps better used elsewhere. So.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a very hot topic in the US right now among admissions officers. So one, on the research side, yes, we do have a few papers now that are looking at AI, but not so much AI implementation actually in admissions offices, but sort of more simulations using AI. And so there's some papers specifically using AI to analyze essays. For example, AJ Alvaro at Cornell has a number of papers on this if you want to look at them. And I have a few more that I actually are on my reading list because I'm writing a book and I need to write a section on AI, and I haven't had a chance to read yet. But there are some papers that are just now coming out, and I know of a couple of people who are looking at AI implementation. What I'm hearing on the ground in the US, at least, is that AI is mostly being used on the recruitment side, not on the decision side. It's being used as a way to specifically target people who the models are saying would be the most likely to admit, enroll, revenue, et cetera. So that's what's being most adopted at the moment. On the decision-making side, they're being pitched things that I personally, I just don't think are particularly helpful right now. Like, so for example, they're saying like, oh, we'll embed it in Slate, the CRM system that admissions officers use. They'll embed it, and then the essays, you know, will provide you, you know, we'll analyze the essay and give you like the top 5 points that are being made, and we'll provide a rating of the writing quality or something like that. That's not really what admissions officers look for. Admissions officers are basically looking for helpful information in the essay that they can use to inform their decision. So having a sort of bullet point list of what is the topic of the essay doesn't really tell you very much as an admissions officer. So it doesn't save too much time for them. So I think we're not yet at the point where we're seeing systems that are being built yet that would be too helpful. But is that an AI-driven process is completely antithetical to everything admissions officers say. So admissions officers say that about you as an individual applicant. We care about what you bring to our campus. We care about you as a person. So if you then say that AI is making the decisions, you have basically just eviscerated everything that they market about their admissions process. So this is a problem that they have to face. Like, it's a direct trade-off between the efficiency of the process, maybe even some sort of equity and fairness that might come out of some objective AI-driven process that I haven't yet seen, and what they say about their own processes and what the university says that it values about the admissions process. So there's a lot of challenges coming down the road for folks with related to AI.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll just say one thing. I totally believe in the, you know, integrity of admissions officers. Hard to I was one for 5 years early in my career at a very selective liberal arts university in the United States. But there is job security in banding together against AI too. So we have to, it's
Right.
it's an interesting kind of look at who's there. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Eric. And great question. I was going to ask you about the ruling that Trump that came up with against Harvard and the race admissions, but actually Lee has framed it in a more holistic way. So Lee, do you want to come and ask that?
Sure. Hi, Michael. Right. So thank you for your talk. And while you were going through all those headlines, I mean, I was thinking about sort of how maybe the context has changed in the last year, if it's changed. And I was thinking about whether the Trump administration is in favor in some ways of a lottery mission because it speaks to their anti-EDI agenda. And so I was wondering if given the pressure campaign that's in place widely on the Barron's 1 institutions, to among many things that the many demands placed on them, revising their admissions criteria away from anything remotely considering or construed as DEI.
Yeah.
So I was wondering. I mean, I'm not sure if your data set captures the current political would be students of the current year or not. I'm not sure if they would be captured in that data or not. But so I was just kind of curious. Then, do you suppose the baseline that you're comparing against the counterfactual of a lottery system has that changed?
Oh, I see. Okay.
Does that make sense? And
yes.
So
you have a lot of questions. You have a lot of questions in there. So let me try to get to that.
Okay, sure.
I'm not good with multiple questions. All right. So first of all, yes. So since SFFA, we have seen declines, particularly in Black students, but also Latinx students at selective schools. The Trump administration effect has been more around, one, their interpretation of SFFA, which is not in the text of SFFA. And I could go on this for a very long time, but basically, I'll just assert that when they have sent out letters to institutions about what they think SFFA means, a lot of the things that they are asserting in there are not actually in the text of SFFA. But the effect of that has been to create a culture of fear around admissions offices about basically potential civil rights investigations that would be issued by the administration that would use the principles that are coming through the guidance that their own offices are sending out, but that are actually misinterpretations of Supreme Court precedent. So there's all of that, but they have also totally eviscerated the civil rights function at the institution. So it's not clear if they actually investigated who would be there to do it because they're trying to get rid of all of them. So it's a total mess. One thing that is not as well known, but that is a source of a lot of concern, is a change in data. So they have actually proposed to change the IPEDS collection. IPEDS is basically our national institutional level data collection. They've proposed to change that to collect a bunch of information about admissions that would allow them to calculate basically just off the descriptive data, who is being admitted by race, by credentials. And so they are afraid that that data is going to be used again by some sort of civil rights office to say that they're discriminating against white and Asian applicants. And we have this data to show that, and that there's going to be, again, a sort of culture of fear around admissions offices about admitting students of color in that environment. So all of that is going on, is having the biggest impact around that. Oh, and then your question about the study itself. Yeah, so this data comes off the national data set. The most recent one is the students who entered in 2009 in 10th grade. So we are looking at older data than SFFA. And that means the estimates of Black student enrollment at the selective institutions would be a little bit lower than they are in the graph that I'm showing you. But they would be nowhere near what the lottery impacts were, specifically for Black students, would still be much worse than the current. The numbers are coming down just ever so slightly at the most selective institutions. It's not good. It's not. I mean, we were nowhere near representation before, so I don't want to pretend that those declines are not bad, but they're nothing close to like 1 or 2 or 2.5%, which is what we see in some of the lottery simulations.
Good, thank you, Lee. That's a great question. Are you worried about the data disappearing?
Oh yeah, yeah. You know, they, you know, this is a long conversation too. I mean, they at one point they were just going to eliminate all of the data entirely. And they eliminated all of the people. They eliminated the security apparatus by which you would actually get access to the restricted use data. So I'm actually essentially a litigant in some of the cases around this because you know, some of these things that they've eliminated are actually statutorily required data. They actually, it's not actually optional for them to collecting some of this data. So there's a lot of lawsuits in the system.
And could the universities sort of create copies and look after them?
We did, yeah, we did. So there are now databases of the data because there was such a fear, especially when Elon Musk was in Doge. They were just deleting data. I mean, they were just taking things offline completely that had already been collected. So there was a very frantic effort to try to save the data, essentially. And now there are repositories of this data sitting out there. It turned out in the long run, almost most of this data still exists, but there are still examples of specific cases, mostly actually, in my understanding, around transgender students. So they eliminated data items around like transgender and non-binary students in certain health data sets specifically. But most of the big data sets actually still exist, but some of them you just can't get access to the restricted use data. So in the admissions data, for example, we have access to actual transcripts of students from high school that you can analyze their course taking. That has been really helpful in trying to simulate admissions outcomes. There's no longer any apparatus by which to get access to that data. It's just been killed off, essentially. So now they're saying it's going to come back, but it's not actually coming back. So like everything, it's a total mess.
Wow, you've given us a lot to think about. If no one else wants to ask a question, I'm going to ask one last question. Men. I was really surprised by that, by that, because you wouldn't necessarily think of that as being a sort of contextual concern of admissions officers.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, it's interesting. We didn't go into it either, but then when I saw the results, I went, of course. Like I know what the grade distributions look like for men and women at the high school level in the U.S., so it completely makes sense when you look at it. And yet we hadn't gone into the study, hadn't thought about it at all. Nobody who talks about lotteries talks about these effects at all. And the size, just the magnitude of effects is quite large. Yeah, so it's
intersectional. I'm assuming it's, you know, it's connected with poverty and race and.
Well, yes, it is intersect. Yes, it is worse, and you know, we have specific efforts around Black men and Latin men, particularly. Rural men, you know, this is a very long ongoing conversation. In the US, it's often called the boy problem in general. And it's been persisting now for decades. You know, actually, you can go back further than that. I mean, I could talk more about like admissions in the early 20th century when women didn't have access to most of these selective institutions at the private level. And they were absolutely overrunning the women's colleges because there were so many young women who were qualified and wanted to go to college and nowhere for them to go. And so the politics of this are kind of complicated because a lot of people fear that if they focus on what they call the boy problem, it seems like a right-wing issue. It seems like something where they're trying to pretend that men, you know, don't control lots of levers of power in society. But it's not, I don't think it's really about that. I think it's about like trying to look at the reasons why it is that boys are underperforming in school. And we don't have a very good understanding of why this is. And I think we need a lot more work on it.
Well, yes, and that links all to other consequences in terms of the manosphere and everything else, isn't it? In terms of Well, look, thank you very much for coming, Mike. You've given us so much to think about, and it's really great to have that level of data and thought and your expertise. And please come back and tell us about the early 20th century culture of admissions data and your historical work. Please join us again next week, everyone. We are turning to digital education and the emotional architectures of digital. Mira Getsky, and of course we'll be here every Tuesday. And don't forget that our conference is coming up next April. We'll be advertising registration for December. Thanks again, everyone, and see you next week. Bye-bye.